What legacy would you like to leave? As part of the Legacy Society, your gift supports the future of the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. By participating in the planned giving process, you can be assured that when you leave this earth, your charitable gift will continue to support this apostolate and its mission of connecting people to Christ. If you're interested in including Iowa Catholic Radio as part of your charitable gift planning, call me, Belle Marasco, at 515-223-1150. Thank you for your prayerful support.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Welcome to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. I'm Jean Thill, and on today's show, we'll be visiting with Dr. Laura Upenieks. She is the Associate Professor and Undergraduate Program Director at Baylor University. And you had a chance to hear a presentation she did.
That's what really inspired this, and she's indulging us today. So it's a great coup to have Dr. Upenieks on the show. We'll return to her shortly. But here we are. For myself, concluding a week in Big Sky Country with a couple of my friends, Archbishop Zinkula and Bishop Bullock. Still, that contest, Jean, is open. Three bishops walk into a bar. What does the bartender say? So send but our listeners can send their quips to Jean, and she'll give you that address shortly.
Right.
Did not in Montana seek out, the Sunday show Martin Goldsmith, who's somewhere in the recesses of the Montana terrain, provides that Sunday classical music show on Sirius Symphony Hall. So did not find him, but but in our own little studio, here we are, and it's a wonderful opportunity. So Dr. Upenieks, thank you for being with us. I don't know if the summer schedule for you abates in any way, or it's time for greater research, but as an academic sociologist and one who weighed in, you talked previously to an audience of bishops and other Catholic leaders at the University of Notre Dame this past February, the relationship between science and faith as a pastoral issue in an age of disaffiliation, and you addressed issues connected with that in terms of bridging the divide. But welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I think probably engagements like that will only broaden your profile within various circles. How did you come to be at Baylor University as a practicing sociologist?
Yeah, so I, did all of my education in Toronto, Canada, at the University of Toronto, where I was born and raised, and I sort of was trained as a quantitative health sociologist. So I was interested in, why some people live longer than others, why some people, in the time they do live, why they get sicker, why they can stay healthier, and in the course of doing that, I came across a body of research on religion and health. And, sociology was maybe a little bit slow to the party. Psychologists, public health researchers, epidemiologists had sort of been studying this relationship for a long time. But, I kind of really got interested in this question of how people's religious and spiritual practices might affect their health behaviors, how long they live, their quality of life, and really got kind of enamored with this body of research. I think as a person of faith myself, I could kind of see the role of faith working in my own life and promoting, mental, physical, and spiritual health. And, kind of pivoted later in my grad school career to sort of writing a dissertation project on the relationship between religion, spirituality, and health. And
was that to get that approved within the department? Was that hard, or even your own advisor?
It actually wasn't. The only advice they gave me was, hey, this is a really narrow subfield. There's probably not going to be that many job postings that are looking for people working in this area. And as it so happened, Baylor was looking for a sociologist who studied religion and health. Kind of funny how life works sometimes. My external examiner for my dissertation is now my department chair at Baylor. And so he was kind of familiar. Small world, yeah. He was sort of familiar with my work, and when the position came open, he reached out and said, "Hey, I think you'd be perfect for this, and would you think about applying?" And I did, and it was really a blessing to be able to study exactly what I wanted to study at a place where, the Christian faith is emphasized, and where students are looking for a faith-based educational experience. So yeah, it's worked out beautifully.
Wow, God's providence really unfolding. Well, you've touched on various threads here that we're going to have plenty to talk about, but I think we're going to have to take a pause.
We are. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Laura Upenieks, the Associate Professor and Undergraduate Program Director at Baylor University, to discuss the intersection of science and faith. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
It's time to man up. Mondays at 9 a.m. Central. Man Up with Joe Stopulus on Iowa Catholic Radio and on demand on the Iowa Catholic Radio app. This is Iowa Catholic Radio, connecting people to Christ.
Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. On today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Laura Upenieks, from the Associate Professor and Undergraduate Program Director at Baylor University, to discuss the intersection of science and faith.
Well, and a tribute to your many gifts that, of course, they load more hats on you and more titles. So that's beware, please, as you want to. But this vocation as a sociologist, and I can't imagine that the Canadian scene is that much different in terms of academic sociology. I think about a pivotal person in the American Catholic realm, Professor Christian Smith at the formerly of Notre Dame. But he talks about the sacred project of American sociology, and I quote, "As a collective enterprise, it's committed to the visionary project of realizing the emancipation, equality, and moral affirmation of all human beings as autonomous, self-directing individual agents who should live their lives as they personally so desire by constructing," and I accent that term, "their own favorite identities, exiting and entering relationships as they choose, and equally enjoying the gratification of experiential, material, and bodily pleasures." That's a mouthful, Dr. Upenieks, but are you an anomaly as a woman of faith and an accomplished, credentialed sociologist?
I would say yes. And I would say the Canadian scene, you're right. I think there's a lot of parallels in the academy being pretty secular, but I think, social science and sociology in particular was pretty secular. I think you could sort of see, postmodern ideas really, they've maybe fallen out of favor now, but really kind of taking over the academy in the 90s, early 2000s. And so, yeah, I would say, there probably aren't that many. Certainly I've not met many, Catholic female sociologists who are doing, sort of quantitative research on issues that are, I think, but also just to the public in general, who I think are really wrestling with questions of, what does it mean to live a meaningful and purposeful life? And, can we do that without faith? And certainly, I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I don't think the answer is that you can do that without faith. And I think, when people have sort of questioned me in, well, how can you be, a practicing Catholic and also study, inequality and power? And I don't see the two in conflict at all. In fact, I see them as complementary, and I see my faith as informing the work that I do and, how I do that work.
I'm curious, and maybe I'm projecting a little bit my own family upbringing, but, my dad was a professor in mechanical engineering at a state university. And around the family household with my four siblings, everything was up for discussion, argument, and you had to bring it. And, so a real critical sense, if the faith is going to, weigh in on something, how can we address that in a credible way that's consistent with the power of reason? Was that something of your own family upbringing, or am I projecting too much?
No, absolutely. So my parents were physicians who, in addition to their medical practice, they also were professors at the University of Toronto Medical School. And so absolutely, we had discussions on issues of, bioethics, issues of, what does it mean to say that, a drug is tested and has been found to be, effective this % of the time. And I think, we were a family that talked a lot about data and evidence. But I think, there was also a sense, both my parents incredibly faithful Catholics, that there was this faith element. And I think they realized, and they taught me from a very young age, that science can answer a lot of questions. We can we can progress in the world, we can make life better for people with science, but ultimately science is going to fall short of really giving us answers to, I think, some of life's biggest questions. And so I never saw my parents have, conflicts between their faith and sort of their scientific vocation. And I think, that was a really powerful example for me, where I realized that I could be a really credible researcher, using data, asking really good questions, coming up with, justified conclusions from my research, but that could be done within a lens of faith and religion and belief, and all of those things.
Oh, praise God for that. And it's a nice segue, maybe, if we begin to touch on some of the themes that you presented to us in February, the group that was gathered, and thinking about this tension between faith and reason, science and the practice of faith. It's socially produced. That was one of your claims, and how different institutions are in play, and our young people are looking around, and they're sizing us up, and what kind of credibility do we have? What do you mean to say it's socially produced? It may not be inherent in the disciplines themselves.
Yeah, so I think the question that youth seem to really be grappling with is, which institutions can I trust to tell the truth about reality? And I think if we think about science and religion as institutions, I think, there's distinct norms and practices and authority claims that each, like what's the domain of science, what's the domain of religion. But I think what we do is we tend to draw boundaries. We tend to say, okay, well, this is a domain of faith and this is a domain of science. And here's what faith can legitimately speak to, and here's what science can legitimately speak to. But these are things that humans are sort of deciding upon, the norms that are being set, whether it's in classrooms or whether it's in, how priests preach, or, messages that are coming from the church at large. And I think it really comes down to who's setting the boundaries, right? Boundaries are arbitrary as we think about them in sociology. And so that there even is a conflict between faith and science, I mean, that in and of itself is a boundary that we as humans have placed. And I think the question that I really raised in my talk was, do we need those boundaries to be so strict? Could we maybe imagine a world where there's more interplay between science and faith, where religious communities are thinking about the role of science in their life, but also where scientific institutions are thinking about how faith might affect workplace cultures, or worker well-being, or just how people think about the world. So yeah, I think the idea of social production is really thinking through, where did these boundaries come from? Are they good to have? Or can we maybe think about a world where there might be a little bit more fluidity between faith and science?
Yeah, which is almost kind of turning some of the project of sociology on its head, right? Thinking that all things are constructed, but
right.
If there's a self-criticism there, that would be one of the areas where that could be applied. And
absolutely.
There's a more organic connection. A word I use, my former students tell me too much, but there you have it. May I pivot for just a moment where representatives of faith traditions, particularly Catholic Christians, let's think about clergy in particular, as much as we want to be authentic witnesses in our own way, sometimes there can be tendencies that undermine the very hope that we have to present this kind of unity that is existence, and the way in which maybe there's actually a kind of exposing a fragility when the environment's add kind of arguments, or kind of getting in a contentious environment, adding on things maybe that amping up on steroids almost, if you will, the kind of apologetic mindset.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question in there somewhere. I'm not sure. Is that something that you would want to caution clergy in particular, but other people who are passionate about their faith and want to kind of bring about this unifying project? Yeah,
I think in research that's sort of been done on how clergy sort of are oriented to science, I think, there's three types of models. One is just the critical model of like, science can't do this, and this, and it's wrong on these, 12 issues, and, let's just push it to the side and let's just focus on faith. Then there's sort of like the disengaged mindset, which is, let's just pretend that there's no conflict. Let's just, everything's great, and we'll just let the world go by, and we're going to do what we do, and maybe handle scientific questions as they come up ad hoc. And then there's sort of the third model, which is probably more, I think, what I would see as being most favorable, and that's what's called engaged or hospitable, where clergy are being educated on matters of science. Obviously, they're very educated on matters of faith. They're engaged in, for instance, I use the COVID-19 example, when all the evidence was coming out on vaccines and masking and, how many people should you have in a particular space and whatnot. So really kind of staying up to date on what's being recommended, and then being hospitable to taking these ideas and at least giving them a thought of how they might integrate with, the virtues and the domains of faith that we're interested in. So, I think we probably would see evidence of all three of those orientations to science if we looked at Catholic parishes throughout the United States and the world. But I think the one that would allow faith and science to have a symbiotic relationship would be that engaged and hospitable mindset, where we're being educated on science, we're thinking about it deeply, we're wondering, and that's not to say that you have to accept everything that science says. If there are things that are, extremely in conflict with, something that, faith or a teaching of the church, I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to change it, but to realize that youth and people in the congregation are being bombarded with these ideas and culture at large, and to kind of know how to have conversations with them about it without outright rejecting where they might be coming from and where they might have heard this information from.
So you're referring to how the Notre Dame conference was a kind of laboratory, if you will, the kind of engagement that you would commend. Absolutely.
I think, again, there's so many issues, right, to think about now, even more so. I mean, AI came up, obviously with Pope Leo's encyclical, really addressing how we might think about the role of AI in society moving forward. I think those types of, again, and there may not be consensus that's achieved, but I think being willing to sort of step out of your comfort zone and engage with ideas of people that you may or may not agree with. I think that's really the only chance faith and science have of, coming to a deeper symbiotic relationship versus, this conflict perspective that's sort of pervaded the academy and the secular world for a very long time. And so if we're going to challenge that, then I think there has to be a willingness and openness, an attitude of being engaged and being hospitable towards one another.
Yeah, music to my ears. Now, Jean, don't give me the evil eye here, because I know we have about 2 minutes before the break here, but I'll open this up and maybe we continue beyond that. But so as we do so, and you commended Catholic schools when they are realizing their mission of cultivating some of these virtues in a Christian school, Baptist, like Baylor, I imagine it's also flourishing in this way, but the kind of dispositions, including awe and curiosity, this openness to mystery and beauty, do you see Catholic schools, or do you have data that says this is something that's being inculcated?
Yeah, I don't have specific data from Catholic schools. I know that Dr. Chris Baglow and Heather Foucault-Camm are doing great work on this at Notre Dame. But yeah, I think, if we think about the Catholic school, they really are places where credibility can be built in practice. They're really, these mediating structures, because they're teaching these habits of inquiry and awe and integration. One bit of evidence that I do have is if we look at academic scientists, if we look at biologists and physicists and chemists, the more that they are able to cultivate awe in their lives, the better they are as far as flourishing and physical health and mental health. And we actually found, I've done a study with Dr. Brendan Vaidyanathan from Catholic University, and we have found that scientists who have higher levels of religious and spiritual importance in their lives seem to be better able to see awe and to see beauty, and ultimately it's not just good for the academy, it's also good for them. It's good for their own personal mental and physical well-being.
Without compromising their intellectual rigor to society.
Exactly. Yeah.
So those are some of those virtues. So, Jean, I think we led up pretty nicely here,
if I say so myself. That's right. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll return with our conversation with Dr. Laura Upenieks, Associate Professor and Undergraduate Program Director at Baylor University, discussing this intersection of science and faith. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
Thursdays at 9 a.m., join Julie Nelson and Chris Magruder as they chat about faith, family, and the feminine genius. It's Catholic Women Now, here on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and on demand on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, connecting people to Christ.
Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen.
I personally am finding this very fascinating, Dr. Upenieks. Thank you for what you're offering to us. You talk about, in some ways, the kind of formative environments, and not just in the classrooms or in the halls of religious faith formation ways, but you believe this is something that could be much more pervasive in the work world, in business, healthcare, other environments where people are at, the trades and things, that this could be something that we maybe have a natural attitude that would be ever more, organically connected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's certainly ongoing research thinking about how, faith, religion, spirituality can be integrated into different workplaces. I mean, I think a lot of the research, at least that I'm aware of, has sort of focused on, more white collar organizations. But yeah, I think, what we're maybe trying to think about here is like a conceptual model. I think that was sort of my argument for Catholic schools as really sort of modeling structures for how this might be done, in the larger society where we're just open to having conversations about, faith and religious socialization, but then also the more technical, scientific, academic aspects of the job. And again, I think, the same habits of inquiry and humility and integration are kind of the founding, principles that we would want to sort of integrate. So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, if we're going to move beyond the faith-science conflict perspective, I think that, all domains of society probably need to be more open to this form of integration. And I think it can be done. I think Catholic schools can really be a leader in showing how that might be done within an educational institution.
And so there's not going to be a title change anytime soon. I mean, the challenge of disaffiliation for all of us, but would you have hopes that we're beginning to see something now, and the number of people affiliating with the church, entering the Easter sacraments and other things? Do you think we've got enough evidence to say there is a trend here and that something is happening, or is it premature?
I do think, I would say cautiously, yes. Certainly the numbers of conversions this past year, I think, were the highest that they've been, in decades. I think the one thing that's a little bit maybe a little premature in my mind is, just to think about how many people religion lost over the last 30 or 40 years, and to think about, yes, there certainly is maybe this revival, this, increase in conversions, but I think we also want to think about the fact that, we're not yet even close to replacing what we lost from the 1950s and the 1960s. And so, I think I would be comfortable in saying there is growing interest in matters of religion and spirituality. And I'm not really sure why that is. It might have something to do with, just a lot of unrest and uncertainty, at a global level going on. But I think, people are sort of grappling for answers and for meaning and for, these epistemological questions that all of us as humans have. And I think, the church can be a place where they can find these answers. And I think that's kind of, at least from my perspective, I teach the OCIA class at my parish in Waco. And that's, in dialoguing with folks who've wanted to come into the church, that's the answers that they've been given, that, like, this provides me with a deeper meaning that I can get from the secular world. And so, I have hope and faith that this will, continue to happen. But I think to say that there's been a complete religious revival and we're back to where we started, it would be going too far.
Very temperate, very balanced, as always, Dr.
But we want to get there.
Yeah, but you
Yes.
do fortify our hope, and you've offered us substantial fare. With only 20 seconds left, you knowing that someone like you, the vocation that you're fulfilling, gives me hope personally. Baylor, Division I athletics fans, the Big 12. I have a problem with Baylor once in a while. But do you feel well supported in
Absolutely
in the environment you're in?
Yeah.
Well, blessings on your work, and may these summer weeks and months offer you some time for refreshment and renewal. And look forward to the next time when I see your name at a conference. It'll be a magnet drawing me to participate.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Bishop.
This has been another edition of Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. Thanks to our guests and to all of you, our listeners in Iowa, Nebraska, perhaps even Texas, to the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
You can hear Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen every week on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Join Iowa Catholic Radio for the Daily Gospel Reflection with me, Father Nick Smith, by subscribing to the podcast or listening to the Catholic Morning Show, weekdays at 7 Central here on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. Encounter Jesus.